My parents had, as they do, I suppose, on all children, a performative influence. If, in retrospect, I would say that my father um, had a kind of mantra that he would repeat, and which, intermittently I would find irritating, but has nonetheless achieved his result. I've never forgotten it, and it was this: son, whatever you get out of life, get understanding, and and from mother, and from mother, I learned to be irreverent and spontaneous, and to seek pleasure. Um, um, and so father's kind of meditative, contemplative obsessiveness was balanced by mother's restlessness and interest in diversion. And so those were kind of two constellations of factors that mom and dad communicated to me. Dad's parents had been academics, and had died and left him an orphan, in fact. And he was quite preoccupied with my academic career. I would say that Dad erred on the side of being too intimate, too in my face as a child. And so I found separation extremely difficult, although not as difficult as it turns out he found it. Mother was much more, I think, balanced psychologically, and so we were able to have a kind of intimate, reciprocal relation. At the same time, she could let go and let me find my way. My grandmother was kind of completed the menage a trois there, and she kind of adjudicated their disputes. She lived with us until her death in '62, and from her I learned what feels like an exquisite sense of the momentary. Grandmother would sit silently in her chair, and I can remember as a child on the floor, I must have been under 5, and I would simply watch her, and she would point out the dust floating in the afternoon sun, and how exquisite that pattern was. And so grandmother was the inspiration for, I suppose, my interest in the phenomenological and the aesthetic. And at Ohio, as an undergrad at Ohio State, I found the courses I took in existentialism and phenomenology the most compelling. Although the English department is where I finally transferred after initially being a history major. So, but I would say that enduring interests remain. In fact, I'm reading now a study of historians' autobiographical experiments. And I'd read a couple of them, like George Moss, who's well known in history of masculinity and so on. And it was the fourth year, though, that was pivotal for me. I had transferred into teacher education, not because I wanted to be a teacher, I confess. I wanted to be a professor, but it was the draft, actually, to be truthful. And I think it's a little awkward to say that because people sort of like dismiss my interest out of hand after knowing that. But I think people enter professions for all kinds of quirky and even what appears to others be dishonest reasons, and yet then develop an authentic interest. But and for me, I think that it was a kind of flight path enabled me to keep a certain distance from it that I never that served me well, in the sense of being able to be critical and theoretical even when I was immersed in the first year of teaching high school English. But in that fourth year, I signed up for an experimental urban education program. It was 1969, and Don Bateman, whom I still have in touch with and arranged an 80th birthday party for a couple of years ago. Don Bateman, who's basically a linguist, although in his background he had studied with Robert Penn Warren at Minnesota and knew Southern letters, but his big research money was all in transformational grammar. But he had been radicalized, like so many people, by the '60s. And when I met him, he was clutching a book that had just appeared in English, and it was Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And so that became the key text, as it has been for so many, for you as well, then, by your response. And in that seminar, then, we grappled with those ideas and went into Columbus's inner city to work with in tutorial relation with struggling students, and it was really my first. I grew up in a suburb of Columbus that was absolutely all white, absolutely all white. And so as critical as I have been and continue to be of racism in the South and the segregation of especially private life, public life has been forcibly integrated in the South. And then in the spring, I did my student teaching in an inner city, all-black junior high school, and not that further documentation is necessary, but I ended up teaching Soul on Ice, which shows how naive I could be. My mentor teacher was this white West Virginian woman, and she just bleached white when we were discussing Cleaver's notion of rape as a political action, and the eighth graders were quite beside themselves. They, suddenly they weren't diagramming sentences; they're talking about Cleaver's idea of the menial, and even though that went well, that is, they played along with me. And I managed to get through student teaching, mainly because this Don Bateman had such clout. And so even though I think the local officials in the school were kind of horrified at what I was up to, they nonetheless let it happen and approved. But I did have a dim sense that I was out of my element, and that I really didn't know what I was doing, and maybe I should do something else. And so I took a job in an elite public high school outside New York City, which was a profoundly imprinting experience. In that, it was really, I would say, where my own class trajectory was heading. That is, if we had been successful and reclaimed the church pew wealth, we would have the kind of money to live in a place like that and send my kids to a school like that. It was a 9-period day. I taught 4 classes, never more than 15 students. It was an elective system, and so we had to, of course, teach Hawthorne and Shakespeare, but I was also able to teach a course on existentialism and even run an encounter group, which had been an interest of mine in grad school, and I had continued, not the Esalen version, excuse me, but the NTL, National Training Labs. And then I'd done some Tavistock work. And what I had to confront at Schreiber High School was that even though the faculty, I thought, were in general superb, and so the quality of instruction was in general as excellent as I could imagine at that time. And the curriculum was strong, and even though 98% of these kids went on to college, some 30% went to the Ivies, it was a disaster. Partly it was a historical moment, of course. It was 1969, and the disaffection was palpable. But the question of meaning seemed to hang over the high school like a large shadow. And so even though these kids had it all, in the sense that this Midwestern middle-class kid had imagined having it all might be, they even had the intellectual resources that I had worked so hard to obtain, and they had the critique of society. They were articulate. They were everything I had struggled to be, and they were that already. And it was very insufficient. And so that left me with this problem of secondary school education as a problem of meaning. There was never that kind of bureaucratic surveillance of what I was doing, and so I was able to focus on the kind of the affect of the place, and got to know some students quite well and personally. And it was that experience that left me thinking I wanted to study education as an academic field. And I became interested in autobiography after I graduated. in '72 from Ohio State. The dissertation was really focused on this kind of shocking problem for me at Schreiber, that they could be so educated and be so unhappy. And I didn't focus because in part I think I was too immersed in the historical moment to gain any distance from it. But I focused instead on the way that the school seemed to me specifically contributed to the estrangement, and its effect on the subjective formation of the students, and in particular the way that it split off the official curriculum, if you will, from their own sort of quote private and subjective meaning, preoccupations, and so that there was this kind of divide, rather than seeing the curriculum as an opportunity for them, in fact, to understand their own situation. The curriculum became this kind of elaborate distraction from it, and so the main part of the dissertation was what was later published as Sanity Madness in the School. It was these 12 ways in which schools drive children mad. And then at the end, I tried to imagine what kind of a curricular organization might in fact support some bridging of this divide between the curriculum and subjective formation, and how it might be organized. And in particular, I focused on the importance of solitude and solitary study as a one means of the student struggling to find language for what might seem strictly private, and particularly academic language, and then group experience, some kind of dialogical encounter that Furrier had spoken of, and that I had experienced in the Tavistock and the NTL. That is the way that really open, honest confrontation, and sometimes, but also self sort of confessions and authentic speech. The effort at authentic speech, how that can be revelatory, and that so that the group itself also then could be a kind of contrapuntal, but not contrapuntal, but contrapuntal to the solitary study. And so that's how the dissertation ended. And after I took the job at Rochester, I focused on the subjective formation. It wasn't clear to me initially. I even have an essay from that period called "Search for Method," and I came upon the Latin infinitive for curriculum, and seized upon it as a kind of iconic symbol for what I thought I was searching for. That is, this sight of the curriculum as simultaneously academic and subjective, and then tried to devise a method by which one could systematic, I put that in quotation marks, study that site. And that was the regressive progressive analytic synthetic method, and it's a hodgepodge. Speaking of umbrellas, the regression owes the notion of regression is pretty much in the psychoanalytic tradition, and derived from my reading in psychoanalysis, and which had been fairly, I would say, superficial at that stage. In an abnormal psychology, and in the Tavistock work especially, which was about peeling back layers, and in the regression, the idea was to try to return, not to remember from the point of view of sitting here today, but to try to return and enlarge the pool of memory, that is, to try to re-experience. And the device I employed for that was to focus on sensory elements, like the dust in the air, the pigtails and the girl who sat in front of you, to try to remember what it felt like in that room. In the progressive, I added that really in deference to Sartre, who really is one of the major influences in my life. The early Sartre, before the Marxist conversion. The incompleteness and indeterminacy of of subjectivity is an opening onto the future, and it's contemplation of the future that the progressive moment then invites. What fantasies, and it could take many forms. As a teacher, intellectually, I've always supposed that those fantasies really are about the present, that it's really a kind of a device to try to disclose elements of the present, but by thinking about the future. And then the analytic moment comes later, and at first I thought I would employ an already extant theoretical grid to enable us to try to think about what we'd. But I concluded quickly that it was really better, even though it meant that it was more clumsy and it could go in innumerable directions, but to leave it really open to the student to decide how to. So whatever sort of sense you wanted to make of it, the point of the analytic isn't to try to superimpose a grid, but rather to see what kind of narrative coherence can be made toward a re-synthesizing of the subject in the public space. So, you know, after you've sort of dismembered yourself and hopefully re-experienced aspects of your past, some of which you may have wanted to forget, and then reimagined the future, and then narrativized what you've discovered. And you pull yourself together and go into the classroom, as it were, and operate from presumably a much more complex and profound reservoir of subjective possibilities, by means of which you can engage students' responses. So that's the autobiographical method, and Sartre and Freud were obvious influences.